computers, and telecommunications have pushed our world into an ever-deepening digital age. And as the United States continues to pave the way in technological advancement, the role of the Federal Communications Commission has never been more critical. But not everyone has been able to keep up with the rapid pace of technology, and broadband access challenges are still a stark reality in parts of rural America. Tonight, Commissioner Brendan Carr of the FCC joins us to talk about what's being done to bridge the digital divide, granting small-town Americans access to the 21st century communications tools necessary to stay competitive in a global economy.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us for this Rural Town Hall. I'm Christina Loren. Let's welcome tonight's featured guest who will be with us for the next hour, Commissioner Brendan Carr of the FCC. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, Commissioner Carr. And let's dive right into our discussion and start with some background on what the Federal Communications Commission does and how the agency has changed as the technology that we use to communicate has rapidly evolved from wire and radio communications to television and the internet.
Well, Christina, thank you so much for having me on. Great to be with you again. This is such a timely topic to talk about internet access. It's so vital for so many of our rural communities, from educating kids to telehealth to precision agriculture. Your question is a great place to start. What is the FCC? You know, the FCC's founding in some way goes back to the sinking of the Titanic, when people realized we didn't have a great system in place to coordinate the use of radio and emergency distress signals. That resulted in a Radio Act of, I believe, 1912 that ultimately led to the creation of the FCC. You know, it was all about how do we manage the airwaves, promote their use for the public interest on radio. And then, of course, we entered, decades of debates over television stations and the FCC's role there. And now increasingly, it's about wireless connectivity and internet connectivity. So we administer billions of dollars in subsidy programs to make sure that rural America gets the same fair shot at internet connectivity and the economic opportunity that it creates as those living in urban and more densely populated times. So it's an exciting place to be at the FCC. Traditionally, there's 5 of us that are commissioners. Right now, there's 4 of us, 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats, and we work together to try to promote, in our statute, it's called the public interest. And we do that across a variety of different sectors. So it's an exciting time here. All kinds of new technologies coming online, new generation satellite systems, fixed wireless services, fiber. And so while we're not where we need to be yet in terms of connectivity, I'm very excited about where we're going to be in hopefully a very short order ahead.
And that's what we're so excited to talk to you about tonight. And of that group of 5 commissioners, I will say I've never seen a commissioner take such an interest in rural America as you have. And our viewers are really going to get a chance to see that access to high-speed internet is becoming more and more essential just to staying connected and competitive in this sprawling country. Although that digital divide you were just talking about has narrowed considerably, many remote areas, rural areas, they still lack the broadband infrastructure needed to keep them from being left behind. Let's talk about what's already been done to narrow that gap and the work that's left to do to close it.
Yeah, you're right. We've made a lot of progress over the last couple of years. In particular, at the FCC, internet speeds are up. Prices are down, more families have been brought across the digital divide. But if that data applies to a town, a couple streets over or a family down the road, and it doesn't apply to you, then it's largely meaningless. So we have to keep going until every single family has this fair shot at next generation connectivity. We need more infrastructure to be built. We at the FCC need to free up more airwaves. That's the wireless spectrum that can beam next generation connectivity. And we now have, at the federal level, enough dollars appropriated to end the digital divide. For a long time, that was a challenge. Do we have the money to get this done? And the answer to that question now is yes, we do. In some ways, that was the hard part. But the mixed news is we're now at the really hard part, which is how do we properly administer these billions and billions of dollars so we get the job done? And I'm a little worried that we don't have a sufficiently targeted plan in place to take these billions of dollars and get them into the ground, connecting Americans. So it's a big opportunity, but also a big challenge that we have to deliver on here.
That's a little concerning. The good news is we actually have a rural provider who's going to be joining us a little bit later on in the conversation. We'll get to hear from him, but the money is there. So at least we are at that point. That's really great news. When we talk about rural broadband, let's just offer some clarity for our viewers. Are you using it as an all-encompassing term for both mobile broadband that uses 3G, 4G, or 5G, as well as your home internet connection that operates over a wire?
Yeah, you're exactly right. When I talk about rural connectivity, rural broadband, it encompasses all sorts of different technologies. So fiber, a wired connection, a lot of people are familiar with. 5G cellular is also a new competitive technology. What we call fixed wireless, so beaming from a tower directly to a device in your home. This new generation of low Earth orbit satellites, including Elon Musk's SpaceX or Starlink service, which is a high-speed service, better than a lot of the older generation of satellite technologies. And so, yeah, I think we need to look at every tool in the toolkit. And this is one of the challenges is everybody loves fiber because it's probably the highest speed connection. And so a lot of the broadband plans you're seeing come out of the administration in some states right now put a very heavy thumb on the scale for fiber. In some ways, that's good because we believe it's future-proof. But it's not all else being equal, meaning you can put up a fixed wireless connection virtually overnight that can bring really high-speed service to a community. Not as high speed as fiber, but very high-speed service, enough to do multiple simultaneous Zoom calls. And that, again, can take place in a matter of a weekend. Fiber builds can take literally years to build. And so if someone says, I only want to get fiber, or if the government says, I only want you to get fiber, the other way to think about that is they're saying, you should stay on the wrong side of the digital divide for years longer than necessary until that fiber can get to you. It's great when it does get to you, but we need to give states and rural communities the shot at getting across that digital divide, as soon as possible, because there's so many costs that come from it. So yeah, from my view, we need to take an inclusive approach to all those different technologies that you mentioned.
That's great. Now, you have intentionally visited small towns across the country to hear directly from rural broadband builders and providers. What are some of the primary challenges that they're facing, and where do you see room for opportunity?
Yeah, I've tried to do this job the way I think anybody inside of DC should do a job, which is to spend as little time here in Washington as possible. So, right when I was sworn in back in 2017, I immediately flew down to Claremont, North Carolina, where there's a fiber manufacturing plant, and met with the crews working there. I spent a lot of time with tower crews, with fiber splicers, the people running the directional boards, because I wanted to cut out the layers of lawyers and lobbyists between me and the people that are actually the boots on the ground building. And when I travel, I talk to these crews. What's jamming you up? What's slowing you down? You're not always going to hear the same thing that a lawyer or lobbyist, in a meeting here in DC would tell you. And so that's where we identified a lot of the permitting challenges, a lot of the regulatory red tape. These are tough jobs, as you're seeing. These are crews that climb, 1,700 foot, 2,000 foot towers. And they can do those tough jobs in hours, but it can take years to get the permits to do it. And just a couple of weeks ago, I was in Casper, Wyoming, meeting with a small wireless provider, Union Wireless. I was walking around their warehouse or laydown yard, and they had 70 miles of conduit sitting there. They had 90 antennas sitting there. These are, technologies that are ready to connect families today, but they're in the warehouse because they don't have the permit from the Bureau of Land Management to go install it. And so that's one of the challenges I'm hearing about increasingly is we've spent all this money out of Washington. People are purchasing the connectivity to build it, but they don't have the permits to do it, that we haven't streamlined infrastructure. If you're just spending money and not streamlining the infrastructure rules, you're just stepping on the gas and the brakes at the same time. So that's one opportunity that I see is we have to, provide the accelerated support for crews to, get this equipment out of their laydown yards and actually into the rural communities.
I love that. And I love how you have that firsthand knowledge of what rural communities need. Rural communities, in my opinion, the salt of the earth. These are wonderful people. Often, though, they're not the squeaky wheel that gets the grease in Washington. A lot of times, rural communities, people just want to get their work done, and they don't want to cause a scene. They don't want to cause an uproar. I love what you're doing. I love how you're going out there and meeting them face to face. But you're actually braver than most because you climbed some of those Wi-Fi towers with a number of crews. How has that firsthand perspective of the job that they do helped to inform some of the decisions that you make on the Hill?
Yeah. Well, look, you talk about salt of the earth, and that's the way to describe America's hardworking tower techs. These are women, these are men. We got about 27,000 tower crews right now. And when I spend time with them, one of the things that comes clear is we need more. Everyone I talk to could take more work, could do more if they had more trained tower techs to do this. We have about 27,000 tower techs in this country right now. we have to add about 20,000. So I've been going around looking at community college programs because in 8 to 12 weeks, you can go from no skills to the mix of classroom and technical climbing skills. I mean, trust me, if I'm up there, anyone can learn how to do that. Technical climbing skills to land a good paying job. And you can make upwards of $70,000 right off the bat coming out of 8 to 12 weeks of training. Super high demand job. I mean, look, they're tough. You're on the road a lot. There's no question about that. You're away from your families, but it is a way to, get a solid middle class job. But again, we also need it for the country. And that's what I tell these crews when I meet with them is thank you. There's particularly as we come out of COVID-19 and living on the East Coast, all of the lives of us here in DC largely shifted onto the internet with COVID-19. That simply would not have been possible if it wasn't for these tower crews continuing to go out there and build. I mean, most people, they flip open their smartphone, they turn on their TV, they just think it's going to work. Maybe they think it's magic or pixie dust, but it's these women, these men that are climbing these super tall towers, hanging this infrastructure that are getting the job done. And so meeting with them, helps me, put in place these jobs programs, helps me talk about the support that they need. And I think that's a key, again, going forward to complete these infrastructure bills. We're short workers. There was a story I heard from one contractor recently that said on Sundays, they go to church and they pray that their construction crews are going to show up on Monday. And it's not because they don't want to work. It's because they may get bought by a larger company that also needs crews. And so there's just a lot of competition right now in that space. And all the infrastructure money has not even hit the ground yet. For the broadband side, we're probably a year away from these billions of dollars working its way through the agencies into the ground. And when it does, that's going to put further pressure on supply chain challenges, workforce challenges. So again, those are components that I'm not convinced those of us in DC have really put a plan in place yet to deal with.
Well, it sounds like that you are ahead of the ball there. You touched on this earlier. I wanted to show our audience a picture, though. Beaming high-speed internet to remote areas from fixed wireless sites like this. Is this one of the solutions? And tell us about how it works.
Yeah, you're exactly right. So this tower you're seeing there is in a small town, Evansville, Wyoming. I think it's 2,000 or 3,000 people, horse country, a lot of ranches. I went out there with the telecom crew not too long ago, actually climbed that tower there. And the technology is, they beam a high-speed connection right from those antennas you're seeing directly to a small device on someone's home. And then it's effectively Wi-Fi inside the home at that point. And that tower is getting what we call 100 over 20 megabits per second, which is, very fast, high-speed internet. To give that a comparison, 25 over 3 is enough to do multiple simultaneous Zoom calls. So this is 100 over 20. And yet this also highlights one of the challenges. The federal government is going to call those homes and ranches that have 120 from this particular site completely unserved. They're going to treat it the same as a community that has 0 over 0 megabits per second. Why? This goes back to our first conversation about fiber. Fiber is awesome, and we want everyone to have fiber. But because this is fixed wireless over unlicensed spectrum, they're not going to count that as a served place. And when you step back and you look at all of the thousands of families that truly have 0 megabits over 0 megabits, I mean, they don't even have one of those fixed wireless towers, that should be the place that we focus our efforts on in DC first, not overbuilding a place where there's already been private sector investment. So it's a good story in the sense that it's a story of bridging the digital divide very, very quickly and effectively. But it's also a story about storm clouds on the horizon because the federal government is going to overbuild that provider rather than going to a place that has nothing first.
It's hard to hear that. It's really hard to hear that, especially when the funds are readily available. What I love, though, is that it was a recent FCC authorization that made it possible. You had to actually take down some regulatory hurdles. Talk about how they can slow down broadband bills by significant amounts of time, and that red tape can take years to come down. But you have been able to break through some of the barriers. How much of a challenge has that been for you, and what are some of your success stories there?
Yeah, we made some really good progress over the last couple of years. One of the things that we saw, particularly as 5G, this new technology was building out in this country, is you needed to put up a lot more cell sites, but they needed to be small cell sites. So they didn't need to be 200, 300-foot towers. It was basically pizza box-sized antennas that could go on existing light poles or existing towers. And the challenge that we saw is some of the biggest cities in the country, from San Jose, San Francisco, Manhattan, were just charging exorbitant fees to providers to hang those small cells. And in some ways, I say that's great for Manhattan and San Jose that they're getting money for it. But what was happening is that was sucking up all of the capital that was being allocated to build into rural communities. So, I think it was San Jose charged $1 million just for carriers to sit down and have a conversation about adding small cells. That's $1 million less that couldn't go into the outlying communities. And so we heard from a lot of small town mayors. I met with one in Fishers, Indiana, Scott Fadness. He had a small town where they had 60 plus small cells up in his community at a point in time when San Jose, the capital of Silicon Valley, had 0 small cells. So we went to him and said, what are you doing? And he said, first, we do cost-based fees, which means we don't look at permitting as a profit center for our city. We just recover our cost for processing the applications. 2, we have a shot clock so people can get a decision from us quickly. And by doing those 2 basic things, he was an attractive home for small cell investment. So I learned from that, and we took that back to the federal level. We put that in place. At the federal level, we put caps on fees, we put shot clocks on actions, and that led to a really massive acceleration nationwide of small cell builds that held us in good stead, particularly during COVID-19. But to your point, there's challenges that remain on the federal lands side, which is a big issue. The further west you go, more and more higher percentage of lands is owned by the federal government. If you pick a plot of land that you need to serve with a wireless service, for instance, put up a new tower, if it happens to be public land, it takes twice as long to go through the permitting process than if it's on private land, and it's substantially more money. So the federal government needs to do more to get its house in order on this permitting front, and that's going to make a difference in rural communities that are predominantly in and around those federal lands.
Absolutely. So interesting, the perspective, the insight, that San Jose story. I don't think any of us would have thought that that was happening right there in the Silicon Valley. San Jose, an area that was started on agriculture. Let's talk a little bit about agriculture. High-speed rural broadband has become essential to modern agriculture and to our farmers who feed the world. Precision agriculture uses sensors, drones, satellites, data analytics, all important tools for today's farmer. Now, we're seeing more and more autonomous tractors as well. They require precise GPS coordinates. Do you think that the FCC recognizes how critical high-speed internet is to a farmer's competitiveness and bottom line?
Yeah, absolutely. We certainly do. I mean, I remember being on a visit to West Lafayette, Indiana, doing an actual in-person town hall there with some farmers, and they told me, they said, look, if you look on the desk of any farmer nowadays, you're going to see an old coffee mug full of USB drives. And the reason is that their tractors, their combines, their drones are pulling massive, massive troves of data, but they didn't have the high-speed connection to send that data back to what we call the cloud or a data center to crunch it and put it to productive use. So they just had these USB drives and they were tossing them in coffee mugs. And that's why getting a high-speed connection all across rural America is so important. Some people say, well, what's the big deal? It's, an Internet of Thing device or a weather sensor. It's intermittent data. It's not a lot. And that's not true at all. If you look at the, the average, acre of cropland, the data that we've seen is you can pull, enough data off of each individual plant, whether it's, to your point, photos or soil samples, to amount something around 20 gigabits of data. And again, to put that in perspective, that's about, a multiple of what most people use on their smartphone every month. So when you look out there at cropland, the way I tell people to think about it is think of acres and acres of cropland, every single plant. Think of that as a smartphone and the amount of data that you need in a high power connection to get a smartphone to work. And then that gives you the sense of why we need super robust, high-speed internet across rural America. And America's farmers and ranches are just so technologically advanced. I mean, as you know, and your viewers know, it really, staggers the mind. I was in a small town, Moline, Michigan, met with a young kid, Jason, who actually he was about 36, and he had started in farming about 20 years ago when he was in his teens. And the kid was an absolute whiz when it came to technology. So if we can get the high-powered internet connections into the hands of America's farmers and ranchers, it will make it even easier for them to do probably the most important job, which is to feed the country and feed the world. And when we get that connection there, yields go up, the use of fertilizer goes down. I mean, there's all kinds of knock-on benefits when you're really able to use the computing power of a high-speed connection and add that with the combines and the tractors and all that they can do today.
Absolutely. With rising input costs, what we're seeing right now with inflation, our farmers need all the help they can get to stay competitive. Let's talk about another key issue, telehealth access in rural America. It was magnified by the pandemic, how we really need it. Some residents, they have to drive for hours just to see a doctor. But this is something you've actually been addressing head on. Tell us about your telehealth initiative, the Connected Care Pilot Program.
Yeah, this is so important for rural America on multiple levels. One, we're seeing rural hospitals and healthcare clinics just close by the dozen around this country. We've got a doctor divide. And a high-speed internet is one way to stem that and make sure that Americans living in rural communities have access to quality care. And my introduction to this came on a visit to the Mississippi Delta, a small town called Ruralville. I visited there 3 or 4 years ago and went to a healthcare clinic, North Sunflower Medical Center, and met with an older woman named Miss Annie. And she told me that she noticed the first signs of diabetes when she woke up one morning with blurred vision. She tried, regular traditional care methods and wasn't seeing much progress. But that North Sunflower Medical Clinic had a new trial where they sent her home with an iPad, a Bluetooth-enabled blood glucose monitor, and every morning the iPad would go off, and she would, check her blood glucose level. It would send the number to her iPad. Her iPad would crunch it. It would give her instant feedback: eat this today, don't eat this, exercise this way. If she forgot to do it, she would get a phone call from her healthcare provider. Her A1C level came down. She never felt better. And to me, it just a light went off, because we've been supporting at the FCC for decades internet connections to brick and mortar healthcare facilities. But what I learned there was we don't need people's access to care to drop to zero when they leave the facility. After all, if we can keep people healthy in their home, then we keep them out of the most expensive part of the healthcare system, which is the emergency department. And so we looked at that model, which we sort of thought about as the healthcare equivalent of shifting from Blockbuster Video to Netflix. Again, you don't need to go to a brick and mortar facility anymore. We built on that for a nationwide model. And it just happened that we stood that up within days of the COVID-19 pandemic hitting, and it proved so valuable that people could stay home, do video visits, not have to go to a hospital. And so we were really pleased with the progress that we've seen there. There's some regulatory relief that we need to keep going on, because a lot of the reason it worked was waivers from HHS and otherwise. So, the good news from COVID-19, to the extent there is any, is the amazing uptake in telehealth and mental health services, behavioral health services. And we at the FCC need to do our part to keep that going.
Absolutely. You think of the lasting implications. I think a lot of people are more comfortable now just going online and speaking with a doctor. And so this can be really key to thriving rural communities going forward. Rural broadband, it's so critical right now. Let's switch gears for a moment, though, to rural content, because if you are going to expand broadband access in rural America, rural Americans are going to want to watch programming that's relevant to their lifestyles and livelihoods. But due to recent major media mergers, some independent programmers have actually been squeezed out of the market, including some rural programmers. What are your thoughts on consolidation in the media sector?
Well, look, I think everybody should be watching rural content, not just because I'm here today. Even when I'm not on, people should probably be watching your channel. That'll be a good thing as well. And there is high demand for this. I think that's very, very clear. And there's some challenges when it comes to the regulatory environment to making sure that media companies that are focused on rural content are getting a fair shake for distribution from cable companies, from satellite companies. And there's some regulatory frameworks in place at the FCC. And for me, the guiding principle has to be, how do we empower consumers to make the best choice for themselves and decide, I want this content, I don't want this content, and how do we move it off of a centralized approach? It's a challenge because there's just decades of regulations and statutes that sort of intersect in this area. But I do think they could use some fresh thinking from the FCC and from Congress, particularly as we see this massive shift to digital, to online, a lot of breakup of the traditional cable package. How can we do this in a way that's going to leave consumers empowered to get the content that they really want, including rural content?
Yeah, and taking down some of those barriers to entry for some of these independent programmers as well, so that the viewers can decide. It's so important. I really appreciate hearing you say that. Okay, we're just getting started. We're going to pause for a quick break, but stay with us. When we come back, we're going to hear from a multitude of voices from all across rural America and what questions they have for Commissioner Carr. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back to tonight's Rural Town Hall. I'm Christina Loren. Tonight's featured guest is Commissioner Brendan Carr of the FCC. And Commissioner Carr, this is the part of the broadcast where we get to hear from some of the rural leaders that make this nation great. And we get to hear the concerns and questions that they have for you. Are you ready for it?
Ready? Yeah, let's do it.
All right. First up tonight is Chairman and CEO of Connected Nation, Tom Ferree. The national nonprofit develops and provides the tools, resources, and methods that help states and communities create and implement solutions to their broadband and digital technology gaps. Thank you so much for joining us, Tom. Go right ahead.
Well, Christina, thank you. And thank you to RFD-TV for taking time to discuss this very important topic. It impacts millions of Americans living in our rural communities. Connected Nation is a national nonprofit. We've been in this space for about 20 years now. And in the course of those 2 decades, we've seen how being disconnected disproportionately impacts America's small towns and our country's rural communities, our farming lands, our ranch lands. But we've also seen those same areas thrive when we work in partnership with others to bring about better connections to those residences and those businesses. Commissioner Carr, I know you have a deep understanding of this complicated issue as well, and in particular, some of the unique challenges that rural communities face in keeping up with modern technology. I also know of your wireless expertise in particular. So my first question to you is, in 2022, as we stand here, what are some of the biggest challenges that face a rural community's ability to participate in a national 5G rollout? And in particular, what type of infrastructure should these communities be prioritizing and building as part of this infrastructure law program?
Yeah, that's a great question, Tom. And thanks to you and all the advocacy work that your organization is doing to hold those of us in DC accountable to make sure that we're delivering. I think when it comes to 5G in rural America, I mean, to me, that's the most important measure, not when 5G goes live, or I should say went live in Manhattan or San Francisco. I was just in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, and they had gone live with 5G a couple years ago. And to me, that's a much greater measure of the progress we're making as a country than when America's big cities get 5G. But to get 5G, you need a couple things. One, we need to free up a lot more spectrum or airwaves to make this work. And that's a job for those of us in DC. It involves coordinating and working with a lot of other federal agencies that have spectrum to free that up. The second piece of it, as we sort of talked a little bit about, is infrastructure. You need to what we call densify the network. And that means for 3G and 4G, you could have 1, 2, or 300-foot tower. It could cover for 5 to 10 miles. But for 5G, you need to look at that same footprint and add about 10x the number of cell sites. And that's what we've been seeing is just a massive densification of the network, meaning adding new cell sites on top of the existing cell sites. And one thing that small towns can do and any community can do is to make sure that their permitting makes sense. Are we rolling out the red carpet for these new small cells? Are we, making sure that we have an eye towards the economic benefits that come to our communities once it's built, rather than looking at the build itself as the profit-making opportunity? So I think those are some of the things that we have to do. And obviously, we're having a lot of money come from the federal government. It hasn't poured out the door yet, but states and local governments need to work together to apply to the federal government, to the Commerce Department in particular, with a plan to get those dollars. So I'm happy to work directly with any state broadband office that's working on that to make sure our rural main streets get served.
Well, thank you for that. You mentioned, or you alluded to the timing, sequencing of this funding release. I guess I would ask you next, you touched on it earlier. The pandemic obviously showed all Americans how indispensable a broadband connection is, regardless of your geography, your age, or your background. And here pretty soon, the federal government's going to be making very large decisions about how much of this funding, this extraordinary once-in-a-lifetime funding, how much of that is going to go to each state. Obviously, some states are going to get more than others, really as a product of where broadband is and isn't, based on the decisions and accuracy of the data. A lot of times this data has been challenged traditionally in the past by getting to absolute accuracy, and especially as we're talking about billions of dollars at stake here. My question is, these maps that the FCC are going to soon produce that will help steer those investments, will the public have an opportunity to challenge these coverage maps before the state allocations are made final?
That's a good question. So for people that are maybe thankfully not steeped in this issue, broadband maps has been an issue at the federal level for quite some time. And long story short, for years, we've had maps at the FCC that are supposed to tell you where broadband is and isn't. And obviously, it's been terrible in the sense that it's been overestimating for a very long time where service is. So some problems underestimating, but principally it's an overestimating problem. And Congress finally allocated $100 million to the FCC to get accurate maps. I had called for us to get those maps done last year. I'm a vote to move as quickly as possible getting those maps done. But to your point, there is going to be a challenge process so that when the initial maps come up, whether it's carriers or other people that may have qualifying information, and say, no, this map needs to be improved. It shows service here and there's not. And the reason why it's so important that we get those maps right is, to your point, that's going to drive where a lot of this funding goes, not just where within a state, but also how much funding a state gets. There's going to be a baseline funding that every state gets. But then the lion's share on top of that will be determined by the number of unserved locations. So we have to go as quickly as possible at the FCC. But I do think it's important, whether it's reserving some money for a true up down the road, but that the final allocation of funds to a state should be made based on a challenged and therefore perfected. It's not going to be perfect, but a more perfect map, and that would be my view.
Okay. Thank you so much for joining us, Chairman and CEO of Connected Nation, Tom Ferree. We appreciate your voice on our Rural Town Hall tonight. The hardworking broadband providers are also a big part of what you're trying to accomplish in expanding broadband access with the FCC. Let's bring in Denny Law, CEO and General Manager of Golden West Communications, headquartered in South Dakota. Denny, thanks for joining us. Go right ahead. You're on with Commissioner Carr.
Thank you, Commissioner Carr. Thanks for the opportunity. A question I have for you is that the FCC is charged with ensuring universal service of telecommunications. It's really the idea that every American should have access to robust and affordable telecommunication services, and that includes now broadband. The agency is scheduled to release a report on the future of universal later this summer, and I'm wondering if you could share a little bit maybe what's top of mind for you as the FCC considers its future role in this mission of getting and keeping rural America connected.
Yeah, well, great to see you again, Denny. I've had a chance to spend a lot of time with Denny and some of his telecom crews out there, including in Southwest South Dakota. We were on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, beautiful area, very wide distances between homes, and Denny's crews are out there right now, trenching fiber, pulling conduit, getting communities like that connected. So it's a real success story. And one of the reasons why Denny has been so successful, as he mentioned, is there's this federal program called the Universal Service Fund. It's about $10 billion a year that we use to subsidize those internet bills, because it can cost $30,000 to $40,000 to run a mile of fiber. And when you're talking about areas of this country with less than one person per square mile, pretty quickly you can see why we need a federal subsidy to get that done. The way that we fund that federal subsidy program has been to add a line item charge to consumers' monthly bill for traditional telecom services, the easiest way to think about it. And that charge has been increasing and increasing as the basically the revenue base for traditional telecom services has been declining. And so it is on essentially a death spiral right now, which means it is not a sustainable way of funding these $10 billion a year bills. And so the FCC has been tasked by Congress to come up with a report for how do we create a more sustainable path for the Universal Service Fund. One idea that I've tossed out there is looking to large technology companies, whether it's Netflix or Disney Plus, or digital advertising platforms like Facebook and Google. They benefit tremendously from the outlays of this fund. They use these USF-supported networks. And so my view is they should start contributing a fair share. And while have this glut of federal dollars right now from all these infrastructure bills, it is going to run dry eventually. And so I think we got to start putting that universal service system on sustainable ground so that Denny and crews like his can continue to connect South Dakota and other rural communities.
Thank you, Commissioner. And on the theme of sustainability, I think if you could share a little bit in terms of certainly the focus is on, and rightly so, of making sure that broadband service is available to rural consumers across the country. But could you also talk about for just a moment the necessity that after it is built, that it will need to be sustainable for certainly the future, certainly the foreseeable future? And what are some perhaps means or opportunities that may assist in that sustainability?
Yeah, when it comes to these rural internet bills, I mean, obviously there's two big components of the cost of build. One is, we call sort of the front end, upfront, or we call the capital, the CapEx portion of it. But the other portion of it is OpEx. I think a lot of people don't realize that, the OpEx is a far higher percentage of the combined cost, OpEx and CapEx, than what a lot of people think. And a lot of our infrastructure build ideas are really good at funding CapEx, and they fall behind on OpEx. And that sort of leads to an unsustainable situation or discourages people to build in the first place. And so as we think about funding these initiatives over the long term, we need to do so with an understanding of the proportional cost of CapEx and OpEx and make sure that we are creating a sustainable funding model across the board. And frankly, the other portion of sustainability, stepping from the internet provider itself, is the end user. And we've been looking at the affordability for end users as a portion of the digital divide. And over the last year or so, we've stood up about $24 billion in new affordability plans, both for low-income Americans, but also just more generally for school kids and whatnot, regardless of the level of income in the family. So I'd encourage everybody to go to the FCC's website, and you can look at what we call ACP, the American Connectivity Program. And there's another program called ECF that has to do with connecting school kids. But check out the FCC's programs, because you may very well qualify, even regardless of income, for an affordability subsidy. And the money's going to get used by somebody, so let's make it go to people that really need it.
Absolutely, which is why we're so glad to have you on with us tonight. And Danny Law, thank you for joining us. Great questions tonight. CEO and General Manager of Golden West Communications. We appreciate the work that you're doing to connect rural America. Our next question comes from a familiar face here on RFD-TV. UNMC Chancellor Dr. Jeffrey Gold wanted to weigh in as well. Thanks for joining us, Dr. Gold. Go right ahead with your question.
Commissioner Carr, thank you so much for all that you've done for the rural communities of our nation. And I appreciate the opportunity to ask a question about telehealth. The opportunity to get healthcare information and to have real-time exchanges with patients and with healthcare professionals in rural America is critical, and the pandemic has underscored that need over the last few years. Perhaps you can talk about what the FCC is doing to help us continue to deliver more and better telehealth services to rural America.
Yeah, well, thank you, Dr. Gold, for that question. Great to see you again. The pandemic saw, in a lot of the rural communities that I saw, up to a 30-fold increase in telehealth. A lot of these small providers were doing, 1 or 2 telehealth visits, if any, and it went into the thousands in some cases, even in terms of an uptick in telehealth visits. So there's a couple things the FCC needs to do. One is we've stood up these new funding programs so that people can purchase the technology that they need for doing these telehealth visits, whether it's the internet connection itself in some programs, or in other programs, even purchasing the devices that are needed. And so I think the FCC needs to continue our work there. In fact, we have a 3-year pilot program we're doing right now on these connected care. The other thing is Congress. Congress needs to make permanent a lot of these waivers that HHS gave and others that really made telehealth make sense from a provider's perspective. And in the long run, I think the healthcare system itself, the insurance payors in the system, should look at picking up the cost of those internet connections and tablets and devices, because after all, that's the portion of the healthcare system that is benefiting from the decrease in costs and payouts that we're seeing, because people are staying healthier with these connected technologies.
All right. Thank you so much, UNMC Chancellor Dr. Jeffrey Gold, for joining us. We're getting all perspectives across rural America. A lot of questions for you. Great ones coming in. Our next guest is Leila Soberanis, Senior Government Relations Representative from the National Farmers Union. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to join us, Leila. You're on with Commissioner Carr of the FCC. Go right ahead.
National Farmers Union represents approximately 200,000 family farmers and ranchers nationwide, and thank you for the opportunity to join the discussion. NFU was pleased to see the signing of the infrastructure, the Investment and Jobs Act into law this year, and we've been closely following it as it brings what it will bring to rural America. And for far too long, a lot of our members have really suffered prior to the pandemic, and the pandemic has made it worse. Our farmers are anxiously waiting to see change reach their states, and they want to know what they can do to get involved on the state level. You mentioned you're about a year out. Can you share what farmers can do now to get involved to ensure that investment reaches their states?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks so much for that. Yeah, there's a lot of different funding sources that are going on right now, but one of the biggest is this one that the Commerce Department is running. And the way that works is they're effectively going to give a block grant to the states, and the states are going to put a broadband plan together, apply to Commerce for the funding. So I think one of the most important things that can take place right now is for community leaders to identify, and usually this comes out of the governor's office. So most states have a governor's office broadband officer or some title like that, but get together with them and help them identify the needs of the community, help inform that application to the federal government, because that's going to be where a lot of the money comes from. Again, we're about a year out from that money actually hitting the ground, but now is a very opportune time to get with your state broadband officer or the equivalent that it might have and make sure that your perspective is included in that state broadband plan.
Great, thank you for that. And my next question is, every family farmer and rancher can talk personally about how corporate consolidation has negatively affected and impacted their family, their business, their local community. To remain competitive in today's global economy, farmers need choices, especially affordable internet options, as mentioned, for precision agriculture, weather pattern access, telehealth, buying, selling inputs and products. You mentioned consolidation. Can you please expand on that, and then what you see as key in advancing competition in the broadband realm?
Yeah, well, it's a great question. And the balance that we have to strike at the federal level is how do we, allow as many new entrants as possible, but also how to make sure that a company has the scope and scale to make the massive investments needed, the capital investments in this infrastructure to bridge the digital divide. So it's a challenge that we try to strike with the right balance. Recently we've seen an increase in competition for high-speed, in-home, fixed internet over the past, and so I think we're trending in the right direction, but it's always a tough balance to strike here at the federal level.
Great question. Thank you so much for joining us. Leila Soberanes, Senior Government Relations Representative for the National Farmers Union, looking out for family farmers all across the country and ranchers as well. Thanks for joining us. Next up is former Senator Kate Bowles. She is currently serving as the Nebraska Director of USDA Rural Development. Thanks for spending some time with us, Senator Bowles. Go right ahead with your question for Commissioner Carr.
Commissioner Carr, as you know, broadband is essential to rural economic development. It means that farmers can engage in precision farming and students can participate in distance learning. What do you think that we can do to simplify the process of making sure that broadband gets to rural communities, either through reducing red tape or providing more support on the ground?
Yeah, thanks so much for the question. I think that's exactly right. It's going to be a combination of funding and cutting red tape. Again, if we're just spending money and not streamlining the permitting process, then we're just jumping on the gas and the brakes at the same time. And we've seen at the federal level, when we reduce the cost of permitting, when we speed the timeline by which permits are given, we see a massive spike in internet build. So again, right now, I think the focus in Washington has been a little too much on putting money out there and not enough on a comprehensive plan to streamline infrastructure. And that leads to problems like we talked about earlier with conduits sitting in laydown yards and antennas sitting in warehouses. In fact, there was a GAO report that came out about a week or so. And GAO is sort of the watchdog arm, the investigative arm of Congress. And it said that we now have broadband programs spread across 15 different agencies in 133 different programs, and yet there's not a national strategy coordinating all those efforts. So we need a national strategy at the federal level. It needs to address workforce shortages, supply chain challenges. We got to get our maps done at the federal government level. But to your point more directly, it's streamlining the permitting process and targeting the funding to the truly unserved areas, the places that still have 0 megabits over 0 megabits.
It's got to be so hard. If you are joining us and you have slow internet, do not worry. The FCC is working very hard. Commissioner Brendan Carr is on the job. Thank you so much for joining us. Senator Kate Bowles, Nebraska Director of USDA Rural Development. We appreciate you adding to our conversation. We're going to pause for a quick break, but stay with us. Our Rural Town Hall with Commissioner Brendan Carr of the FCC will continue right after this. Welcome back to tonight's Rural Town Hall. I'm Christina Loren. This has been an eye-opening hour so far. Let's jump right back into our conversation with FCC Commissioner Brendan Carr. Now, the FCC is accountable to Congress, and its actions are also monitored very closely by stock market investors. Does it ever feel like every move that your agency makes is under a microscope? And how much pushback have you had on your rural initiatives?
Yeah, well, it's a good question. The FCC does impact, there used to be an estimate of 1/6 of the economy. So it's no surprise that people are watching closely what the agency does. But we've been working together at the FCC, getting smart policies across the finish line. And for the most part, there's a lot of support for our rural broadband efforts. I mean, after all, a lot of the members of Congress that are on the commerce committees that oversee the FCC represent rural communities, and they hold us accountable to make sure that we are prioritizing, rural broadband. So I think that's a good thing.
Okay, now many of us have heard of the FCC in terms of TV and radio. For example, someone used bad language on the air, they get in trouble with the FCC. But with so many options out there, how do you always have eyes on all channels? Is this now done through modern technology, or are you still using human observation?
Yeah, it's a good question. And when I first heard about the FCC and came here to work, I thought the job would be exclusively watching Super Bowl halftime reports and keeping out for any wardrobe malfunctions. Unfortunately, that has not been any component of my job so far. When it comes to things like that, we rely on consumer complaints. So there's no shortage of that. If something happens on local radio, if something happens on local TV, you're going to see complaints flow into the FCC. And we have a whole system for reviewing what people file. Sometimes people file about things that never happened. And we have a way of sort of having our team sort of suss through that.
Okay, but if a tree falls in the woods, nobody hears about it. I guess the FCC doesn't get involved unless there's that consumer complaint. That's so interesting to me. I've got another question about those loud commercials that come on. Do you have any power over changing that?
This is funny. This is an issue that I personally feel pretty passionately about. And whenever a super loud commercial comes on and I'm at home, my wife will kind of give me the eye, like, what are you doing, dude? Like, why are you not taking care of this? It was actually, when I became an FCC commissioner, one of the first things that I asked for a briefing on was, what are we doing about loud commercials? And the FCC said, we haven't been getting a lot of complaints about that recently. I said, well, maybe it's because people have given up on thinking that we're going to solve this. But we did put a regime in place a couple of years ago. But to your point, it doesn't seem like it solved it. So I'm certainly open to taking another look at the federal government about whether there's a more effective way that we can address loud commercials. Long story short, I think the current regime takes an average of the volume of the commercial and compares it to an average of the volume of the TV show. And the problem with that is you'll get people that'll come in super loud at the beginning of a commercial, get your attention, then drop the volume down. And so the averages look like they're about right. That's why I think maybe coming up with another system might be the better way of doing it.
Sunday, 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 and then it goes a little bit lower. Interesting. See, we're finding out all the tricks that they're using. Now, does the FCC have an impact on the life of an average person in ways that we don't think about?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, look, so many of us are connected at our hip, at our palm to smartphones, and making sure that works, making sure that connection's there, making sure it's affordable. When you turn your TV on, there's a role for the FCC and all of that people may not be aware of.
In 1934, when the FCC was established, it regulated wire and radio communications. And so you were focused on wire and radio communications. But today, when you bring in the multiple platforms, you bring in television, you bring in the internet, there's a plethora of viewing options available on any screen, any time of day. How does your agency keep up with maintaining standards and consistency among the vast multitude of communication methods that exist this day and age? And do you feel like you're able to keep up with the times?
I think we have a mixed track record at the FCC. If you look at technologies, the older a technology is, the more heavily regulated it is at the FCC. And the newer the technology, I think in a lot of ways we're rightfully hesitant to impose new regulations on that new nascent technology. We want to see how it develops. The internet was an example of that in the 1990s, to be sure. But I think it also helps for us to step back and say, we have these old regulations on this old technology, and this new technology is competing with it, but it doesn't have the same restrictions from a regulatory standpoint. So I don't think we've done as good a job of leveling the playing field as new technologies compete with older technologies.
I really have had a chance to research your background and what you've done with the FCC. I know you served as general counsel before going into the role of commissioner. What accomplishment are you most proud of during your term with the FCC so far?
Yeah, well, thanks. I started actually 10 years ago this month at the FCC, just came into the regular GS system as a staffer in general counsel's office, got to then work for then Commissioner Pai. And when he was made chairman by President Trump, I became general counsel, then eventually this job as commissioner. I'm most proud probably of our 5G build. We were really getting our butt kicked, to be frank, by China back in 2016. And we put these infrastructure reforms in place that helped to, leapfrog our global counterparts and put America right back up there at the top of 5G. I'd also put the telehealth stuff up there as well. I mean, particularly because it hit right as COVID-19 came, that we were able to help people access healthcare services, life-changing stuff. So those are two of the sort of things that we've done that I'm really proud about.
How long of a term do you serve for?
So commissioners have 5-year terms, and you can go up for another term if you want, or you can roll off the agency. But there's, again, 5 of us, 5-year terms. So each one of us term comes up every year. My term would come up next year, for instance.
Are you going to go up for another?
We'll see. I love doing this job. I can't think of a more fun way to spend your professional time. So I really enjoy it.
How can our audience follow your travels? I know I follow your Twitter page. You're really good about engaging with the audience and showing us pictures. And the time that you're spending in rural America, I think it's a valuable visit to your Twitter page just to see what Brendan Carr is doing across rural America. But how can people find out more about the work that you're doing with the FCC?
Yeah, that's one good place. Twitter, Brendan Carr, FCC there. I'm also on Instagram. I believe it's Brendan Carr USA there, slightly different terminology. But yeah, I try to post a lot of information there. I try to make it a little bit of sugar to make the medicine go down. So I try to be a little funny there. And then every once in a while, I'll just give you the straight, hey, here's what the FCC is doing. But hopefully it's an interesting mix at least. You
have this final year that you're looking at before maybe, possibly, hopefully going up for another term. Is there any one area, single area of focus for you going into this final year?
Well, I think the most important thing is to try to get a hold of all this broadband spending and making sure we get our arms around it in a coordinated way. Because right now it's basically like we've turned the spigot on full blast, and then we've walked away from the hose, and it's kind of whipping around the yard at this point, and we're risking getting taxpayers soaked and not getting the job done. So I think probably the most vital thing we can do is to take these dollars that Congress appropriated and make sure we have the right guardrails in place so that we can say, we delivered for the American people with this investment that Congress made.
And can an everyday rural American citizen reach out to the FCC if they have an issue or concern that they hope can be addressed?
Yeah, absolutely. Tag me on Twitter. That happens an awful lot. People can send email directly to the agency, to me as well. And we're usually pretty responsive with things like that.
So I really do appreciate that about you. You actually listen to the people who have something to say to you, the questions that they have for you, and you take those into account as you're making some of these big decisions. Can you spread that word around Washington, D.C.? Maybe we can get more politicians to spend more time in rural America. We really appreciate the work you've done. We appreciate you joining us tonight. Do you have any final thoughts for our viewers before we say goodbye?
No, thanks so much. Look, we got to not rest at the federal government to get the job done, which my job at the FCC is making sure every single family has a fair shot at next-gen connectivity. I think we're making progress, but we're not raising the mission accomplished flag. We got to do even better to bridge that digital divide.
Well, hopefully you'll go up for another term, because we know that this isn't a solution that's going to happen overnight. So thank you so much again for joining us. Big thank you to Commissioner Brendan Carr of the FCC for joining us tonight. Now, I want to make sure you're aware of this. As election season continues to heat up, so will our conversations with political leaders across the country. We're going to find out what they have to say about the issues that matter most to rural America. So make sure you stay tuned with us. We are going to definitely go in depth as we head throughout the upcoming season, and we will keep you updated right here on RFD-TV. Thank you so much for joining us. Rural Town Hall, good night from rural America's most important network. See you next time.